In the spring of 2016, a grand wedding unfolded in the small town of Austin, Texas, a celebration that drew the community together in a rare convergence of reverence and festivity. Lucas Turner, a 35-year-old pastor who had shepherded the flock of the Light of Grace Church for nearly a decade, stood at the center of the occasion, marrying Marilyn Wilson, a 35-year-old district judge whose reputation for unwavering integrity had earned her respect across the county. The event took place on a sunlit Saturday in April, the sky a brilliant expanse of blue that stretched over the modest church where Lucas had built his life's work. Hundreds gathered to witness the union, parishioners who had sat through his Sunday sermons, legal colleagues who had faced Marilyn in courtrooms, and family members who traveled from distant corners of the state, all united in their belief that this marriage represented a seamless blend of faith and justice, a partnership destined to inspire. Lucas had been shaped by a childhood steeped in devotion, born to a preacher father and a mother who sang hymns with a voice that could hush a room. He had grown up in a modest home just outside Austin, where the walls echoed with scripture and the air carried the scent of his mother's baking on Sundays. From a young age, he had felt the call to ministry, delivering his first sermon at 17 in a borrowed suit that hung loose on his lanky frame. By his mid-20s, he had taken the helm of Light of Grace, a quaint building with weathered brick walls and rows of wooden pews polished smooth by years of use. Under his guidance, the church had flourished, its congregation swelling with townsfolk who found solace in his messages of humility, purity, and the redemptive power of a disciplined life. His presence was a quiet strength, his hands often clasped in prayer, his eyes reflecting a conviction that drew people to him like moths to a flame. Marilyn's path had been carved from a different stone, one of grit and relentless ambition. She had been raised in a working-class neighborhood on Austin's east side, where her parents toiled long hours, her father a mechanic with grease-stained hands, her mother a seamstress who stitched late into the night. Education had been her ladder out, a scholarship to law school her ticket to a world beyond the cramped apartment of her youth. She had excelled, her mind sharp and her resolve unyielding, rising through the ranks of the legal system with a tenacity that left her peers in awe. By 35, she had secured her position as a district judge, her courtroom a domain where she dispensed rulings with a clarity that brooked no argument. Personal life had taken a back seat, her days consumed by case files and her nights by the soft glow of a desk lamp, leaving little room for romance until fate intervened. Their meeting had occurred a year prior, almost by chance, when Marilyn attended one of Lucas's services on a whim. She had heard whispers of the pastor's growing influence, his ability to weave scripture into lessons that lingered long after the final amen, and curiosity had drawn her to the church one Sunday morning. She had slipped into a back pew, her tailored coat a subtle contrast to the casual attire of the regulars, her presence unnoticed until Lucas's gaze found her during his sermon on forgiveness. Something in his words had struck her, a resonance she couldn't shake, and after the service, she had lingered, approaching him with a question about his interpretation of grace. Their conversation had stretched beyond the emptying sanctuary, spilling into a nearby diner where coffee cups grew cold as they talked. What began as an exchange of ideas soon deepened, a spark igniting between them that neither had anticipated. Over the following months, their bond grew, nurtured by shared dinners, late-night phone calls, and walks along the Colorado River, until Lucas had proposed under a pecan tree in Zilker Park, the ring a simple band that mirrored his understated faith. The wedding day arrived with a flurry of preparations, the church transformed into a vision of celebration. Volunteers had draped the altar in white lilies, their fragrance mingling with the polished wood of the pews, while garlands of greenery hung from the rafters, swaying gently in the breeze that slipped through open windows. Guests filled the space, their chatter a hum of excitement as they took their seats, some fanning themselves with programs printed on cream-colored paper. Lucas stood at the front, his black suit pressed and his tie knotted with care, his hands clasped tightly as he awaited his bride. Marilyn entered to the strains of a hymn played on an old upright piano, her gown a cascade of ivory that trailed behind her, her steps measured but confident. The officiant, a silver-haired elder who had mentored Lucas in his early years, led the ceremony with a voice that carried the weight of decades, his blessings weaving their vows into a tapestry of commitment. Rings were exchanged, their metal glinting in the sunlight that streamed through the stained glass windows, and the congregation erupted in applause as the couple sealed their union with a kiss. The reception followed in the church's adjacent hall, a long room with folding tables covered in checkered cloths. Parishioners had outdone themselves, bringing platters of fried chicken, bowls of potato salad, and trays of cornbread still warm from the oven, the air thick with the aroma of comfort food. A local guitarist strummed melodies from a corner, his notes weaving through the laughter and clinking glasses as guests raised toasts to the couple's future. Children darted between tables, chasing one another with gleeful abandon, while older folks swapped stories of weddings past. As dusk painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Lucas and Marilyn made their exit, slipping into a car adorned with streamers and tin cans that rattled against the pavement. They drove toward a countryside cottage 30 miles outside Austin, a rental they had chosen for its seclusion, a single-story retreat with a wraparound porch and a view of rolling hills dotted with wildflowers. The journey passed in comfortable silence, the hum of the engine blending with the chorus of crickets beyond the windows. They arrived as night fell, the porch light casting a golden halo over the threshold, and stepped inside with hearts full of hope, envisioning a life together that would honor the promises they had made under the Texas sky. The night in the cottage unfolded with an air of tender anticipation. Lucas, having upheld a vow of celibacy throughout his 35 years, felt a surge of nervous excitement as he prepared to share an intimate moment with his new wife. The wooden walls of the small retreat exuded a faint scent of pine, a natural perfume that mingled with the soft flicker of candlelight from the table in the corner. Shadows danced across the room, casting a warm glow over the quilted bedspread and the simple furniture, all chosen to create a haven of comfort for the newlyweds. Marilyn moved gracefully beside him, her silhouette outlined by the dim light as they stepped into the bedroom, the door creaking softly behind them. Lucas's heart beat faster, his mind filled with the sanctity of the moment he had long awaited, a culmination of his faith and devotion now realized in marriage. As they drew closer, however, a sharp, unpleasant odor pierced the air, cutting through the serene atmosphere like an unwelcome intruder. Lucas paused, his brow furrowing as he tried to place the source. At first, he attributed it to something external, perhaps a lingering smell from the old wooden floorboards, or maybe a trace of dampness on the curtains that framed the single window. He took a shallow breath, willing himself to dismiss it, chalking it up to the quirks of the rustic cottage. Yet, as they settled onto the bed, the scent grew stronger, more insistent, and undeniably personal. His stomach tightened as realization crept in. The smell emanated from Marilyn herself, a stark contrast to the pristine image he had held of her. Confusion clouded his thoughts, his senses recoiling as he struggled to reconcile this discovery with the woman he had just pledged his life to. Marilyn sensed his hesitation, her movements slowing as she caught the flicker of unease in his eyes. She shifted away slightly, her hands resting in her lap, and then lowered herself to sit on the edge of the mattress, the springs creaking under her weight. The candlelight illuminated her face, revealing a mix of vulnerability and resolve as she gathered her thoughts. She began to speak, her voice unsteady at first, each word carrying the weight of a confession long buried. She admitted to a chronic illness, a condition that had plagued her for years, its roots tangled in a past she had kept hidden from everyone, including Lucas. Her youth, she explained, had been a whirlwind of reckless abandon. Over 100 men had crossed her path, fleeting encounters marked by impulsiveness and a disregard for consequences. She described nights spent in dimly lit bars, hotel rooms, and borrowed apartments, a life of fleeting pleasures that had left her with more than memories. The illness, a persistent infection resistant to treatment, had become her silent burden, its physical toll manifesting in the very odor that now filled the space between them. Lucas sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as her words washed over him. The ideals that had shaped his existence, purity, discipline, the sanctity of the body as a temple, crumbled under the weight of her revelation. He had envisioned Marilyn as a mirror to his own values, a partner who shared his commitment to a life untainted by the world's temptations. Yet here she was, unveiling a history that clashed violently with everything he had preached from the pulpit of Light of Grace. The smell, once merely an irritation, transformed in his mind into something far more profound, a tangible symbol of her concealed past, a stain he could neither ignore nor erase. His chest tightened, a wave of disillusionment sweeping through him as the romantic haze of the evening dissolved into a stark, unsettling reality. The cottage, once a sanctuary, now felt confining, its wooden walls closing in as he grappled with the collapse of the future he had so carefully imagined. Lucas's turmoil hardened into a resolute decision as the weight of Marilyn's confession settled over him like a suffocating fog. He pulled away from her, his body shifting to the far edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under his sudden movement. His face contorted with a mixture of revulsion and disillusionment, the soft glow of the candles casting harsh shadows across his features. He declared that he could not sustain the marriage, his voice firm despite the tremor beneath it, insisting that this was not the life he had prayed for, not the union he had envisioned through years of steadfast devotion. The words hung heavy in the air, sharp and unyielding, cutting through the fragile intimacy that had defined the evening just moments before. Marilyn, accustomed to wielding authority in the courtroom, froze under the impact of his rejection, her breath catching as though she had been struck. Her pride, a cornerstone of her identity, crumbled in the face of his resolve, leaving her reeling with a mix of shock and indignation. She rose abruptly from the bed, her movements jerky and unsteady, the springs groaning in protest as she stood. Her hands trembled, not just from anger but from the raw ache of betrayal, as she positioned herself between Lucas and the bedroom door. The narrow frame of the exit loomed behind her, its wooden surface scratched and weathered, a silent witness to the unfolding chaos. She refused to let his declaration stand unchallenged, her body a barrier to his escape, her stance mirroring the unyielding posture she often took behind the bench. Lucas, his patience fraying, stepped forward, intent on leaving the suffocating confines of the room and the unbearable truth it now held. He attempted to sidestep her, his shoulder brushing against the wall as he maneuvered around her outstretched arms. Marilyn reacted instinctively, her fingers closing around the sleeve of his shirt, the fabric bunching under her grip as she pulled him back, demanding he explain himself, her desperation palpable in the tightening of her hold. The tension in the room escalated, a palpable force that seemed to press against the wooden walls, the air thick with unspoken accusations and shattered expectations. The floorboards creaked loudly beneath their shifting weight, each step a punctuation in their escalating struggle. Shadows flickered wildly across the ceiling as the candles sputtered, their flames disturbed by the sudden movements. Lucas's frustration mounted, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts as he tried to free himself from her grasp. Her nails dug into his arm, leaving faint red marks that would later tell their own story, her resolve hardening even as her footing wavered. In a moment of exasperation, Lucas pushed against her, his hands pressing firmly into her shoulders, his intent to break free rather than to harm. The force, however, exceeded what he had gauged in his agitation, sending Marilyn staggering backward across the uneven floor. She stumbled, her balance lost in the chaos, her arms flailing briefly as she tried to catch herself. Her retreat ended abruptly when her head collided with the solid edge of a heavy oak dresser that stood against the wall, its dark surface polished to a sheen that reflected the candlelight in fleeting glints. The impact resounded through the cottage, a dull, sickening thud that seemed to reverberate off the wooden beams overhead, silencing the creaks and rustles of the night. Marilyn crumpled to the floor, her body folding in on itself, her limbs splaying awkwardly as she landed. A thin trickle of blood began to seep from the back of her head, pooling slowly on the worn planks beneath her. Lucas stood frozen, his hands still outstretched from the push, his chest heaving as he stared at her motionless form. The silence that followed swallowed the room whole, broken only by the faint crackle of the dwindling candles, their light now illuminating a scene that had spiraled far beyond the night's earlier promise. Lucas gazed down at Marilyn, sprawled lifelessly across the floor, his mind struggling to process the sight before him. Her body lay at an unnatural angle, one arm bent beneath her, the other outstretched as if reaching for something she could no longer grasp. At first, disbelief clouded his senses, his eyes tracing the familiar contours of her face, now slack and devoid of the vitality that had defined her. He sank to his knees beside her, the cold wooden boards pressing against his legs, and reached out with trembling fingers to touch her cheek. Her skin felt cool, unnervingly still, and he called her name, his voice a hoarse whisper that dissolved into the stillness of the room. No response came, no flicker of eyelids, no shallow breath, only the relentless silence that confirmed what he refused to accept. Blood seeped steadily from beneath her head, a dark stain spreading across the weathered planks, its edges creeping toward the frayed hem of the rug nearby. The metallic scent mingled with the lingering pine of the cottage, twisting his stomach into knots. Panic surged through him, a wild, uncontrollable force that set his heart pounding against his ribcage. His hands hovered over her, uncertain, as though some gesture might undo the moment, might pull her back from the edge he had unwittingly pushed her over. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill that had settled into the room, the candles long since gutted out, leaving only the faint gray light of dawn filtering through the curtains. He remained rooted there, minutes stretching into an eternity, his mind a chaotic whirl of guilt and disbelief. Finally, his shaking hand found the phone on the nightstand, its cord tangled from earlier restlessness. He dialed the emergency number, his fingers fumbling over the buttons, and when the operator answered, his explanation came in fractured bursts, something about an accident, a fall, a desperate plea for help. His voice cracked with every word, the reality of the situation sinking deeper as he spoke. The distant wail of sirens soon pierced the quiet countryside, growing louder until they overwhelmed the morning stillness. Red and blue lights flashed through the window, painting erratic patterns across the walls as the first responders arrived. Paramedics burst through the cottage door, their boots thudding against the floor, followed closely by police officers whose stern faces surveyed the scene with practiced efficiency. The medics knelt beside Marilyn, their movements swift and clinical as they checked for signs of life. One pressed fingers to her neck, another shone a light into her unseeing eyes, and within moments, they exchanged a glance that sealed her fate. They pronounced her dead, attributing the cause to a severe head injury, the blunt trauma evident in the matted blood that clung to her hair. The officers stepped forward, their attention shifting to the room itself, scuff marks on the floor, the overturned chair near the dresser, the crimson pool that had begun to congeal. Evidence of a struggle lay scattered in the disarray, a narrative they pieced together without needing words. Lucas remained on his knees, his body numb as the paramedics covered Marilyn with a sheet, her form reduced to a still outline beneath the white fabric. An officer approached him, his shadow looming as he instructed Lucas to stand. He complied mechanically, his legs unsteady, his mind barely registering the cold metal of handcuffs clicking around his wrists. The sensation jolted him slightly, a fleeting tether to the present as they led him outside. The morning air bit at his skin, crisp and unforgiving, as he was guided to the patrol car parked on the gravel drive. Inside the vehicle, the leather seats creaked under his weight, and he stared blankly through the window at the cottage, its once welcoming facade now a haunting memory. The drive to the station passed in a blur, the rolling hills outside giving way to the outskirts of Austin, though he noticed none of it. At the police station, they ushered him into a small, sterile room with a table bolted to the floor and a single overhead light that buzzed faintly. An officer sat across from him, notepad in hand, while another stood by the door, arms crossed. Lucas offered his account in disjointed fragments, his hands gesturing vaguely as he described the night, a nightmare he hadn't foreseen, a moment that spiraled beyond his control. He spoke of the smell, the confession, the push, his voice thick with regret as he recounted how it had all unraveled. His words stumbled over one another, laden with a sorrow he couldn't fully articulate, though the officers listened with impassive expressions, their pens scratching against paper. They saw more than an accident in his story, their questions probing deeper into intent and circumstance, their skepticism a silent accusation that hung between them. Lucas slumped in the chair, the weight of the night pressing down on him, his wrists chafing against the cuffs as the reality of his actions settled into an unshakable truth. The investigation swiftly escalated into a high-profile case that gripped the city of Austin, its details splashed across local newspapers and whispered in the pews of churches far beyond the reach of light of grace. Lucas faced a charge of involuntary manslaughter, the prosecution asserting that his actions, though perhaps not premeditated, had directly caused Marilyn's death. Evidence from the cottage, the blood-stained floor, the overturned furniture, the marks on his arms, painted a picture of a fatal altercation, one the authorities refused to dismiss as mere misfortune. The community that had once revered him splintered under the weight of the accusation. Within the walls of Light of Grace, parishioners divided into factions. Some clung to their belief in his innocence, seeing him as a man ensnared by an unthinkable tragedy, while others turned away, branding him a hypocrite whose sermons on purity now rang hollow against the backdrop of violence. His reputation, painstakingly built over years of ministry, eroded with each passing day, his name no longer a beacon of virtue but a cautionary tale murmured in hushed tones. The trial unfolded in a packed courtroom on the edge of downtown Austin, the building's limestone facade looming over a crowd of onlookers who gathered daily, drawn by the spectacle of a pastor facing justice. Lucas sat at the defense table, his shoulders hunched, clad in a plain gray suit that hung loosely on his frame, a stark contrast to the crisp vestments he once wore at the pulpit. His attorneys mounted a vigorous defense, arguing that he had acted in self-preservation, overwhelmed by confusion and fear in the heat of the moment. They pointed to his evident disorientation that night, his lack of prior violence, and the absence of any malicious intent, framing the push as an instinctive reaction rather than a deliberate strike. The prosecution countered with a compelling narrative of their own, portraying Lucas as a man whose rigid ideals had collided with an unbearable truth, driving him to a reckless act of desperation. They leaned heavily on the physical evidence, suggesting that his strength, even if unintentional, had crossed a lethal threshold, transforming a marital dispute into a crime. Medical experts took the stand, their testimony adding layers of complexity to the proceedings. A forensic pathologist, with a calm demeanor and a stack of notes, confirmed that Marilyn had suffered from a chronic infection, its origins tied to a history of untreated conditions that corroborated her confession about her past. The odor Lucas had described, they explained, was a genuine symptom, a lingering consequence of her illness that no amount of care had fully erased. This revelation stirred murmurs among the spectators, lending credence to Lucas's account of the night, yet it did little to sway the prosecution's stance. It only underscored the motive they attributed to him, disgust and betrayal overwhelming his moral compass. The courtroom buzzed with debate, the air thick with tension as each side presented its case, the truth muddied by the interplay of science and emotion. Outside the courthouse, Austin's residents grappled with their own judgments. Newspaper editorials dissected the story, some casting Lucas as a tragic figure undone by circumstance, a shepherd lost to the very flock he sought to guide, while others condemned him as a man who had failed to embody the grace he preached, his fall a lesson in human frailty. The trial became a mirror for the city's values, reflecting divides over faith, accountability, and forgiveness. Inside, the judge, a stern, seasoned colleague of Marilyn's who had shared countless hours with her in legal chambers, presided with an impassive face, her eyes betraying no hint of the personal loss she felt. She listened as witnesses recounted the night, as experts parsed the autopsy, as attorneys clashed over the line between accident and culpability. The jury, a mix of townsfolk from varied walks of life, sat in attentive silence, their notebooks filling with observations as they weighed the evidence. Days stretched into weeks, the courtroom a crucible where Lucas's fate hung in the balance, each testimony a step toward a verdict that would define not just his future, but the legacy of the life he and Marilyn had briefly shared. The trial concluded with the jury delivering its verdict after days of deliberation, their faces etched with the gravity of their decision as they filed back into the courtroom. Lucas was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, a charge that acknowledged the absence of premeditation but held him accountable for the fatal outcome of his actions. The judge, her gaze steady and unyielding, sentenced him to 5 years of probation and mandated community service, sparing him the confines of a prison cell in recognition of the unintentional nature of the act. As the gavel fell, a murmur rippled through the gallery, a mix of relief and discontent from those who had followed the case with fervor. Lucas stood motionless, his hands clasped before him, the weight of the ruling settling into his bones as he was escorted from the courtroom, free yet bound by the consequences that would shadow him. He returned to Austin a changed man, stepping back into a city that felt both familiar and alien. The Light of Grace Church, once the heart of his ministry, had shuttered its doors in the wake of the scandal, its wooden pews emptied and its stained glass windows darkened by neglect. The congregation had scattered, some seeking solace in other houses of worship, others abandoning faith altogether, unable to reconcile their pastor's fall with the teachings he had once imparted. His home, a modest bungalow on the outskirts of town, greeted him with silence, its walls bare of the warmth that had once filled it. Dust coated the shelves where his books of sermons once stood, and the echo of his footsteps replaced the cadence of his preaching voice. His faith, the bedrock of his identity, wavered under the strain, flickering like a candle caught in a draught, though it refused to extinguish entirely. Determined to find purpose amid the wreckage, Lucas sought a new path. He began volunteering at a shelter for the homeless in a rundown part of Austin, a squat brick building where the air carried the scent of stale coffee and unwashed clothes. There, he worked quietly, his hands busy with tasks, serving meals, folding blankets, sweeping floors, his presence unobtrusive among the staff and residents. He avoided the spotlight that had once defined him, preferring the anonymity of labor to the scrutiny of the pulpit. Guilt clung to him like a second skin, a constant companion as he moved through the days, yet he found a peculiar peace in the routine. The faces of the shelter's occupants, etched with their own stories of loss and survival, mirrored his inner turmoil, offering a silent kinship that eased the ache within him. He saw in their struggles a reflection of his own journey, a reminder that redemption might lie not in grand gestures but in the small, steady acts of service. Time passed, and Austin began to let go of the tragedy that had once dominated its headlines. The newspapers moved on to fresh stories, and the whispers about the pastor and the judge faded into the background of the city's collective memory. For Lucas, however, the weight of that night remained an indelible mark, a lesson carved into his soul that he revisited in quiet moments. Marilyn was laid to rest in a local cemetery, her grave tucked beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree. Colleagues from the courthouse brought flowers, lilies and roses, arranging them in neat clusters around the headstone, their petals a tribute to her legacy. Her name lingered in legal circles, whispered as part of the lore of Austin's judiciary, a testament to the judge who had commanded respect until her final day. Lucas visited her resting place alone, standing before the granite marker as the wind rustled through the leaves overhead. He traced the engraved letters with his eyes, his hands buried in his pockets, seeking forgiveness in the stillness, a pardon from her, from the man he had been, and from the God he still hoped to comprehend, even as the answers eluded him in the quiet of the afternoon.